welcome everybody. My name is John Walsh. I'm the Area Vice President of Clinical with Vaportherm and the host of today's RT Leadership Roundtable discussion. Today we're going to focus on the use of Vaportherm's high velocity therapy for the treatment of respiratory distress as it relates to COVID-19 patients and also non-COVID-19 patients, for those of you that may be new to the therapy, just to understand the various applications of the therapy that go beyond just maybe what we initially may have thought. So on our panel today, we have three respiratory leaders with diverse experience using high velocity therapy in the acute care hospital setting. Shelly Brown, who's a system director of respiratory care services at a health system in Arkansas.
We're about a 750 bed community hospital, and we have been using the high velocity Vaportherm units for about 6 years now. I've been a therapist for about 30 years, and I'm very still get excited about using this product. So I feel that it's made a big difference in treating our patients with respiratory distress, respiratory failure in all patient populations. So
we have Vernon Druses, who's the Director of Respiratory Therapy at an academic hospital.
My name is Vernon Druses. I operate out of Brooklyn, New York. We run about a 450 bed hospital, and been in respiratory over 30 years. Well, we're having a good time over here.
And we have Lenny Youngwara, Director of Respiratory Therapy, Pulmonary Rehabilitation and Neurodiagnostic Services at a regional hospital in Maryland.
I'm a director for respiratory care services in state of Maryland. Work at a hospital that has about 420 beds. We have been using the high velocity therapy for many, many years. And we apply the therapy from neonates, ED, medical floors, and our ICU. So we have been using these way before COVID, and we used it extremely well during the COVID crisis, and we'll be able to discuss more about that.
As of late, we're kind of seeing a spike in COVID across the U.S., majority of the states now. You all have seen the first wave on the East Coast. You guys have flattened the curve. You're really going towards that direction. What advice can you give to your colleagues in the states that are just now seeing their first wave or may have not seen it at all? As an RT director, what advice would your pearls of wisdom that you would give to your colleagues out there that are in their worried fascination, waiting to see what happens in their region to prepare for COVID and kind of get their department, therapies they need, things like that on hand? What advice would you give them?
Yeah, so this is not scientific, but rather experience, and it comes from what we went through here. So initially, we were intubating almost everybody that came in, and that was a process that we thought was going to limit the exposure of the environment from COVID. So pretty much we intubated everybody. And the reality of it is the success rate of extubating those patients successfully post-intubation was not there. So when we started to use Vaportherm early on, we ended up having a higher success of discharging patients and preventing intubations that could have been unnecessary. And we also did find out that that intubation really resulted in higher mortality. And again, I'm saying this is not scientific, but rather observation and experience from what we had here. In preparation for the surge, I would advise people to ensure that they have enough supplies on hand. In the last 5 to 10 years, we have gone through the process of lean, and to the point where we were trying to get as much close to just-in-time delivery of devices that you need, supplies that you need. We have to get out of that mindset during this crisis. You need to hoard stuff. You need to have enough supplies on hand because the supply chain dries up quickly. One of the things that dried up quickly for us was the water, the bags. Not only did they dry out, there was none available in the supply chain. So you need to have enough aerosol water on hand because you're gonna be using it for your events, you're gonna be using it for your Vaportherms and the like. So it will go by quickly. So my advice to my colleagues across the country is try to have enough supplies on hand before it's too late, because yes, it will be too late. You run out of water, you run out of tubing. The good thing that I would say about Vaportherm is we got an assurance. We do have enough DPCs available, that the disposable circuits. There was enough available, and we did not run out. In addition to that, for us, when we started using close enough to all our Vaportherms, we had 40 on hand. When we started using more than those, or we were getting close to 40, we reached out and we were able to purchase an additional 20 quickly. So we were able to beef up our stock quickly with Vaportherm. So it's important to have enough supplies. I think I'm starting to say that over and over again, but it's that would be my takeaway for my colleagues. Have enough supplies on hand.
Yep, and I think that's an important part, Lenny, because as you pointed out, you know, a lot of hospitals were moving to just a supply on demand, right? Or, you know, just to have a, you know, that par level. And so this kind of threw a wrench in the par level with the number of patients and things like that. So that's some great insight. I'm just going to take a pause here off the level. Just a gentle reminder, make sure you're on mute if you're not talking that way. And I'll try to call your name ahead of time. And that way it'll cut back on some of the background noise. So, so Vernon, I'm going to go to you. I know you just went on mute, but as a hospital in New York, how did you prepare, and what pearls of wisdom do you give some of your colleagues out there along with Lenny's?
Well, I could just piggyback off of what Lenny just said. It is so important, and I know I don't like to use the word hoard, but hoard equipment. You have to. I learned a new word. I always thought I knew the definition of this word, the word allocation. And if you're not, what allocation really say is that if you're not a heavy user of a device, the company actually limit their monthly distribution to your institution. So now when you get a surge or a sudden impact, influx of patients that overwhelm your monthly allocation, you're stuck. You're trying to literally, what was the old saying, rob from Peter to pay Paul? And you're looking at, I had to invent things as I went along, just to hold us until the next allocation came in.
Sure.
It's so important to really jump ahead of this thing. Take it. One of the things I wish we did was observe how China prepared as far as it went with equipment, or even other areas that were hit before us, whether it was Italy or other impacted nations or countries. We didn't get an opportunity to do that. And when we forget, whether it's Vaportherm is serving all 50 states, including Hawaii, you know, and Alaska. So if I'm short here in New York, somebody's short in Minnesota. It became a nationwide shortage. So it's very important to really try to plan ahead Like right now, we're looking at other states that are experiencing a second wave, and we're trying to prepare. We're trying to prepare if this comes to New York, and what are we going to do? What do we have on hand? How can we address the surge of patients that we may anticipate if there is a second wave in New York?
Certainly. And I know as an organization, that was one of the things we really wanted to be aware of, not to have the toilet paper mentality or the hand sanitizer mentality, and make sure that hospitals across the U.S. and actually across the world, because, you know, we saw a lot of utilization in the European front when that started to hit that area. So making sure that we never went on back order and were able to supply all of our customers across the country was very important, because every patient deserved to have access to the technology if it was presented to them, right? And I can't agree with you more. And the great thing about this, there's not a lot of science out there right now around this. I mean, a lot of it was learn on the fly, learning the mother of necessity. So this is why discussions are so key in helping, you know, other people out there. So Shelly, I'm going to go to you, and you're kind of now in the heartland. What's the discussion like where you're at, and what's the discussion like? I know COVID spiked a little bit in the Mid-South and through that area. But with this surge hitting so close to home now, what's the discussions been like where you're at, and how are hospitals preparing, and what advice would you give?
So yes, we are seeing a big, well, I'm not going to say a big, but we have seen an increase in positive cases for two reasons. I think one, that clearly there's a lot more testing than there was early on. So I think that's to be expected. You know, the more testing you do, the numbers are going to increase with positives. I would also say, though, that as far as my hospital here in Little Rock, we have seen a slight increase in the number of patients that we are treating that are COVID positive, but not all are critically ill. And I think a lot of that, and I know this is going to sound like an advertisement, but a lot of it is, I think we've gotten better early on in recognizing these patients and dealing with their oxygen needs, and not be so quick to put them on a ventilator. But that being said, right now we do have right now we're at our highest number of ventilators, but it's also the same number that we had. It's equal to what we had kind of early on. And I think early on, I think my point is, early on we were quickly intubating patients when we may not have needed to. Where now we're just seeing more positives, and we've done, you know, the therapy that we feel is best for the patients, and the next step would be going to intubations. But
Sure.
The comorbidities has not changed. So these patients that are getting critically ill have not just one comorbidity, but multiple comorbidities. And that's having to be on a ventilator with any other virus or a bacterial infection, and having multiple comorbidities. This is no different in that respect, if that makes sense.
Puts you at the same risk.
It does. And so, but I think the other thing too is that what I think is important to note, our death rate is unchanged. I know in Arkansas that we do, I don't know what other states' mortality is on patients that were COVID positives that went on ventilators, but I know here in Arkansas that the percentage of deaths is 46% of patients that went on ventilators did ultimately die. But on the flip side of that, there was more that didn't die that went on ventilators. So I know that's a high mortality rate, but at the same time, the survival rate of that's higher, and that I feel good about that. Our hospitalizations are a little higher, but I think it's mainly still because we're seeing more positives and more people. I think that people have probably gotten tired of having to stay home. And so I think the spread of it has increased some. I still, though, see patients coming in that are considered higher risk, which is why they're in the hospital. So we're not to a point here being unmanageable. Fortunately, I did hoarding, I'll say it, very early on. So while New York was, getting hit really hard, I was paying attention and saying, okay, what are the things I feel like I'm going to have? In fact, my supply chain reached out to me and said, okay, we need to start getting stuff. So what I'm dealing with now is other hospitals calling me, hey, do you have any of such and such that I could borrow from you? And unfortunately, I do have some of that, but I can't give it away. I may give a few things, but I definitely don't. I have a stash of pretty much everything. And I've not had any issues with getting the water. I've had that before, though, specifically for the Vaportherms. Vaportherm does not, I don't buy the water from Vaportherm, but I've had issues in the past where I've had trouble getting it, in fact, twice, and it just be a supply chain deal with the company we get it from. And so I learned when those two things happened, when that happened to me 2 other times, I'd already hoarded a bunch of water. So when I'm faced with that again, I don't worry about it. Right now, I have not had to get into that hoarding supply that I have. So supply-wise, we've done well, but I think mainly because we early on started ordering extra things. And we still, every day, it's something I'm going in and evaluating and looking and seeing, okay, have we done this? And then sometimes the therapist will just kind of on their own, and I'm sure I'm not the only one that's had to deal with this, but on their own decide that we need to do something different because it's a COVID patient, but there's no real reason behind it, like, changing certain filters or HMEs on patients more frequently than normal. And it's like, wait a minute, give me your logic behind that and let's rethink this. Because there was a few items I was going through and I didn't understand why. And when I got to the bedside and realized that we were kind of doing things on our own, then that helped me understand better from their perspective, their thinking. So we had to kind of think through that mindset.
Sure. So I'm going to go back out east, and you'd mentioned that you'd used the technology prior to COVID on multiple patients. Describe a little bit about the types of patients you were using it on prior to COVID.
From, I'll call the front line, the ED, we actually do use the therapy for any patients that show up in respiratory distress. It could be hypoxic respiratory distress, or it could even be hypercapnic respiratory distress. We still use high flow therapy because we found out that it does work. It was a study. We did a small study where we were trying to figure out if we use this therapy, can we be able to have an impact on the number of patients that get admitted to our ICU? And we had positive results. And therefore, from that point in time, about 5 years ago, we really started using it for the patients who are coming in any kind of respiratory distress in our ED. We do have thresholds on what settings the patients can be if they are going to stay on the medical floors versus going to ICU. If a patient is using more than 80% FiO2, they'll require a physician from the ICU to assess them to ensure that they can be safely treated in the medical floors. Otherwise, then they'll be transferred to the ICU. We also have a level 3 NICU, and over the years, we've gotten rid of CPAP, which was almost a standard therapy for our neonates, and we exclusively use the high velocity therapy to treat the neonates on that. Other uses we have is for early extubation, we do extubate to high flow therapy, and also using the high velocity therapy to prevent intubation. So we kind of use it from the front door of the hospital through the medical floors, through the ICU, and through the NICU.
Excellent. Shelly, I'm going to go to you because you made reference. What area and what applications were you using high velocity therapy in your institution prior to COVID?
So mostly in our, to be honest, the biggest usage we've had is in our NICU. We have a level 3 NICU, and so it's not unusual for us to have 15 to 20 babies on a Vaportherm unit. We have struggled in the early years of bringing Vaportherm on and getting the staff to buy in with the adult population. However, I would say in the last year, we have increased that usage. I still think we have opportunities in the emergency department, which I'll be working on that hopefully when COVID is slowing down. But specifically in our ICUs and out there on the med-surg areas. And so we've had struggles in that when we have patients that come into the emergency department that say need a nasal cannula at a low, flow of that 1 to 2 liters, the nursing staff in the ED will place them on that. And then later on, when they get a open bed out on the med-surg, then they'll transfer out there. And so that patient a lot of times doesn't get an oxygen order put in. So we don't know about those patients. And so the other issue is if that patient's requirements go up, rather than the nurse calling us, they are setting up Veni masks. And so just last week, actually, in order to close that gap, I've gotten our EPIC department to build a report that we can now go in and look routinely on patients that have had documentation of a Veni mask or non-rebreather. And then last week while I was on vacation and that report went live, I was on vacation calling up here saying, hey, I need you to go up to that floor and get that patient switched over to Vaportherm. And or at least evaluate. And both patients, on that first day, I had 2 patients, sure enough, both out on the med-surg area that had been on Vaportherm or on a Veni mask and needed to be switched over. And neither one of those patients ended up in the ICU. I truly, truly believe had we not done that and intervened, they would have gone to ICU. And so it's also given me sometimes to get nursing to get their attention, you have to show them how you fix the problem on your end before you ask them to quit doing something. And so by building that report, that's what I was able to do and give them an instance of, hey, this is where your nurse put the patient on a Veni mask. The good news is that we were able to intervene. The bad news is that we don't need nurses to put patients. They need to be contacting us when a patient's requirements go up, rather than just think that they're putting them on a Veni mask and let them go. They need to understand that the patient's condition has changed. And so, to be honest with you, that usually is happening on our respiratory floor, where we have your COPD patients or your patients that have CHF and COPD. We call that our respiratory floor, which, I mean, of all areas that you don't want that happening on, it's that one. And so And then in our ICUs, I've told the staff you could save yourself a lot of work when you're extubating those patients that are kind of questionable of whether or not they're going to fly post extubation of remaining off the ventilator, to just go ahead and try put them on the Vaportherm. Don't mess with the BiPAP, because as we all know in this discussion, there's a lot of things involved with BiPAP, the right mask, the patient's tolerance of it. And so I've, been able to get better buy-in with the staff of, using this on whatever kind of patient we have, that we don't think, it's been a slow weaning process to get them off the ventilator. Let's not,
Right.
Go into using something that probably won't work if you can go with the one device that will work.
So Vernon, I'd be interested in knowing, and correct me if I'm wrong, your prior experience with Vaportherm was probably limited prior to COVID. Have you been able to use the technology on patients outside of those with COVID?
Yeah. Funny story about Vaportherm. Being an advocate for the therapy, we had to kind of backdoor it into the institution. So my back door was the NICU. So we started using it on the NICU, and when they saw how successful it was, especially, I guess the timing was impeccable, because as soon as we incorporated with our NICU, that's when the crisis hit. And of course, we needed something that could address the needs of our patients. And we were able to actually acquire, initially we started off with 5, we were able to get 11 total. And that assisted a lot. Now that they've seen the success, I'm actually trying to get them to spring for at least another 10 of them.
Sure. What did you see? I mean, you started in the NICU and then used with COVID. All respiratory therapists, their minds get to turning and they thinking about other applications. What have you been discussing with your team as the potential for, expanding of the technology? What's come to mind based on the landscape in your facility and the types of patients that you use?
One of the things that we noticed about the device is the ease of use as well as comfort. And the reason why that was kind of like surprising to me, because there were individuals that tried to talk me out of Vaportherm. Oh, it's uncomfortable. And we put it on a patient, and the patient is like, you know what? Just leave this right here. And the ease of use, the therapist adjusted so quickly to it, so readily to it, compared to other devices that we use. And the fact that you have more control over what you can manipulate. That's what really made it kind of user-friendly for us. And like I said, we saw success. We saw patients responding to it, and the tolerance and compliance, that spoke for itself.
Sure. Well, that's great insight. Lenny, I'm going to ask you, one of the things that I'm seeing more of now that, we've passed that first hump a few months ago is COVID-19 syndrome. Have you heard much about that as of late? And I know that, we may be too early to tell what the long-term impact of that's going to be, but I'm seeing where patients are now coming back to the hospital, or they're seeing long-term effects from either lung scarring or, other things, fatigue, shortness of breath. And I'm sure that this relates a lot to how bad they were impacted by the virus to begin with. And obviously, as we know, if you're on a ventilator, and some of these patients are on vents, 10, 15, 20, I've heard up to 40 days, right? And we know that a week on a vent or a week in an ICU, the long-term rehabilitation can be, quite lengthy. What are you hearing? What are you seeing? What's the local scuttlebutt on post-COVID-19 syndrome?
We have not seen much of return patients here that were previously intubated. I don't know. I know we've had patients return back to the hospital post COVID discharge, but I don't know from that particular population that we've had any that were previously intubated. The patients that are coming back, they are coming back for other reasons other than COVID-related admissions. The only questions that we've actually had to deal with is how do we treat those patients when they arrive back? They left here COVID positive or they left here COVID negative. Do we treat them the same way, same isolation? So that has been part of the discussion more so than getting back patients that are having the so-called COVID syndrome because of the long-term impact of being on the vent.
Excellent. Vernon, how about you? Has there been much of a discussion? I know for a lot of you, you're still right in the middle of it for the most part. You're either in phase 1, 2, or 3 of opening up. So I know you're still dealing with kind of the aftershocks of what you all experienced early on, but has there been much discussion on your end about that?
No, not really. We did, however, try to jump ahead of the curve by opening up a very functional pulmonary rehab just to address some of these needs. But just like Lenny said, we also, at least to my awareness, have not had a lot of patients come back who experienced any post effects of COVID-19. On the other hand, the multi-symptoms that the children faced, we did have a few of the babies that were affected by COVID-19.
Were you using Vaportherm high VNI on pediatric and adult COVID patients? Did you experience that?
Well, we used it on one. We had one pediatric patient that there was a transfer. We were able to use it on that baby, but not a whole lot of utilization on because at the same time, for some reason, we weren't. Our delivery, and I'm quite sure you guys saw that as well. Our delivery rate went down during the crisis. So either they were going somewhere else to have the babies, but we really didn't have that kind of activity the way we usually did. Because we're still learning about this disease, and we really don't know what effects it would have. Can it pass gestationally or not?
Right. So Shelly, I'm going to ask you a question. You mentioned a spike in COVID patients, and then are you seeing some of your regular patients start to come back? Are you seeing a flow back to the ER like COPD, CHF? Are they returning, or are you guys still slow in that department?
No, and that's a great question because when we look at our ICU census and compare it to last year, it's pretty much the same. And so we're pretty much, our overall hospital census is not where it was last year, but we're only maybe 50 patients down in average right now. But the ICU setting, we're very much where we were last year. And so, because, and that's with saying that, not all of our patients are COVID in ICU at all. So yeah, we're definitely getting back to getting our CHF, our COPD patients. I'll tell you something that people haven't really thought about that we are seeing here. We have really high humidity. So we can hit days with the real high heat index. Last week we had low humidity, but so a lot of people, You know, the weather was nice. It's great to get outside. Doesn't happen that often in Arkansas that you can enjoy being outdoors this time of year. But all of last week it was that way. Well, then Saturday we had really high humidity and we had a lot of people coming in the ED sick. Well, so you've heard about the Sahara dust. And what I believe, and I spoke to my medical director, is that we're seeing people coming in with issues due to that Sahara dust because people were outside last week and then the humidity went up and then they're they're starting to come in sick. And
Right.
so
That may be a topic for another webinar.
yeah, it
The
could
dust
be.
cloud. Yeah, exactly. So Lenny, I guess, you know, you've used this technology for quite a long time. And the facility that you're at has used this technology for a very long time. For somebody that's new, that may not be familiar with this technology and they're looking at it as an investment just for COVID, or they're looking at this therapy and they're trying to figure out, you know, which way do I go? Do I do more ventilators? Do I do high? Something you would tell somebody out there that's investigating this technology for utilization in COVID and beyond, post-COVID? What pearls of wisdom would you share with that RT director?
So my recommendation for somebody who is looking at this as an initial investment or a new investment is that it's actually worth the investment, and I would say why I would say why that is worth the investment is because in the long term you realize that organization-wide you reduce the number of patients that require mechanical ventilation. That becomes any patients who do not require mechanical ventilation are cheaper patients to have in the organization because you are not using as much resources to care for them. The second part of that is length of stay. It reduces length of stay. We all know if a patient ends up receiving mechanical ventilation, their length of stay goes up. Yet patients who are treated with this therapy do not have similar length of stays as those patients that use mechanical ventilation. So whichever way you cut these, it also does reduce, if a leader sets up the program correctly, where patients who are borderline for extubation are extubated directly to the therapy, they do reduce the amount of time they're on the vent. So many different ways that you can be able to reduce the cost to the patient, the cost to the organization, be it through length of stay, be it the cost of care, and many other things. The other part to that is the involvement of your respiratory therapist in caring for patients who are acutely ill, really very sick patients receiving a therapy that prevents them from going to the vent, makes your therapists become valuable members of the care team.
Exactly. So Vernon, just real quick, you had used this technology in the NICU. What, you know, you've seen it now, you first brought it in the NICU, now you're using it on adults. You're kind of seeing it utilization across the continuum there. What were some of the big things that you saw this technology do for your NICU specifically?
One thing I can say is initially we did not take advantage of Vaportherm the way we should have. It is not a secondary therapy, it's a primary therapy. You can't wait till this patient is like totally crapping out and then say, I'm gonna put them on Vaportherm. And it really adjusted our mindset and our approach on how to address a patient in respiratory distress, or a patient that is right on the cusp of that, of beginning to experience respiratory distress.
Certainly.
And what I've been stressing with some of my colleagues is we don't have to wait till you get to 88 saturation. We could start so much earlier. We could keep that patient comfortable. We could keep that patient strong and ventilate this patient at the same time. When we started to use the therapy earlier rather than later, that's when we started to see some really good results and some really good progress. But there's a learning curve. It's compared to, if you compare it to a regular high flow or regular high flow therapy, or there is a tentativeness to use it. And it's up to the respiratory therapist to make the physician comfortable enough to say, come on, we're gonna go this way, you're gonna see results, trust me.
Exactly. So Shelly, I'm going to transition it to you then and kind of lead off of Vernon's topics there. And I know I've personally met with some of your physicians there where you work. If you were to advise a colleague such as yourself in approaching physicians on this technology, what would be the maybe 2 or 3 things that would come to top of mind that you would say you've really got to make sure they understand this? As Vernon pointed out, it's a de-escalation therapy. You've got to start high and work your way down. Don't wait till the last minute. This isn't to pull somebody out of circling the drain. What would be the 2 or 3 things that you would tell your colleagues you've got to get this across to your physicians when implementing this technology?
Well, I think several things come to mind, but the best way I know to answer the question is to start with how the device is attached to the patient. You know, first and foremost, it's a very comfortable device. The cannula is very much has the feel and look, obviously, of a regular nasal cannula. But then you work your way down through the circuit, and what I think that sometimes can get overlooked about Vaportherm is its humidification capabilities. And so that in itself is one of the big things that we did do here that I thought was tremendous on our part was we just put every trach patient on these, and it completely alleviated a lot of issues we were having with patients plugging off on trachs. And so I think it's real important to really emphasize the humidification, how the patient benefits from that when you're blowing these higher flows. And, you know, also with the physicians talking about that don't associate higher flow with high FiO2. You know, sometimes, especially if it's a hospitalist, you want to make sure that they understand, okay, we have these patients, a COPD patient that's over here huffing and puffing, and we know that we don't want to put them on, you know, higher amount of oxygen. We need to use this and get that flow to help meet their flow demand. And so I just, honestly, this device is a shift in the paradigm, in my opinion, with oxygen therapy and what it can do, and how much you're preventing patients from going to that the next level of care, you know, being more acute. We prevent that, and I think that it's real important that you help them understand that. Now, the beauty of our organization, what I would say to department directors, is make sure that you're able to make decisions about patients' oxygen. For example, what I mean here is have an oxygen protocol. Mm-hmm. And basically, when we get an order for an oxygen protocol, it gives my department the ability to be able to choose what device is appropriate for that patient, mm-hmm, with their condition at that time. When we first brought Vaportherm in, my staff said, do I have to have an order for that? And I said, no. And I'm never going to want you to have an order for that. I'm going to want you to have the autonomy to be able to look at your patient and make a clinical decision of what will meet that patient's needs. But you need to know why you're doing it, because you may have to answer to that to a physician. Yep. So I would, you know, I don't go down the route, and I would tell any department director, put this in an oxygen protocol. Basically, our protocol is real simple. If the patient, if they have the oxygen needs that are greater than a certain level, pulse ox 92 for non-COPD patients, we put whatever we need to meet the patient's needs. I think sometimes you can get too caught up in policies and having a policy for something. Vaportherm does not. It is an oxygen device that we can meet the needs. It also has the value of the velocity where you get a little CPAP effect from it. And you want to keep that autonomy for your therapist to be able to not have to have an order to put it on a patient. And that's what, that is what we've done. And now I'm getting more, I think as far as my needs, neonatal, I went the opposite route as Vernon bringing it in. And John, you know this, I did not introduce it to my NICU because I knew that I would not be able to get the approval to get them purchased quick enough for our neonatologists because they already knew about Vaportherm and already had their buy-in. I needed to be able to go into a different route to bring it into the adult side. So I went the exact opposite. Know your organization and how they view things and where you can bring it in. And so, of course, when we got it approved on the adult side, then that opened the door to start using it in neonatal. So my issue now, I think, is going to be, we use it a lot in neonatal. Now that we've gotten on the adult side in a better place where we're using it more, I'm probably going to have to buy more in order to meet the demands for the adult and neonatal. So that's pretty exciting to me.
Well, in short, I want to thank all three of you for joining us today. I think the information that you all shared will be useful to users and non-users alike. For those that are kind of experiencing COVID for the first time, maybe not yet, maybe preparing for it, and then also sharing your insight on the after effects and the utilization of the technology beyond COVID and in multiple areas of the hospital. So again, thank you all today. I appreciate your expertise and thank you for joining us, and I hope you have a great day.